Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lett.
In this episode, we are posing the question, is this how you thought it would all end? And we reached out to a few of our friends, the writer Michelle T., the writer Meg Elison, who is returning to Scary Thoughts again, and the composer-artist Lawrence English, and we asked them to help us answer this question. The question, is this how you thought it would all end? And before we start, I would like to invite you to write us. We are at that's WHATTHE, at scarythoughts.org. Also like to apologize for the audio quality. We normally do this in the same room together, but we're doing this Zoom experiment like everybody else, and so the audio quality isn't quite what we wished it was. So our first guest is Michelle T. Many of you may know her as the author of Valencia and Black Wave. She has recently written a really fantastic book about Tarot. How were you first introduced to Michelle's work?
Well, you and your wife Monique basically pushed her books in my hands.
Oh.
And Valencia was the first one I think you guys lent me. And I just immediately fell in love with it. I mean, I love memoirs of people who do fucked up things, but also remain like kind of a jovial and upbeat voice in the memoir. Like that just gets me. If somebody has gone through utterly terrifying bad behavior, but is still funny, like that's just it for me. And all of her books are basically like that. And she speaks a lot about San Francisco that I just caught the very tail end of, even in the early 2000s, and it is just completely gone now. I think I've read almost all of her books at this point.
Her first full-length novel and her young lesbian memoir is called Valencia, and that street is literally a block from my house, and a lot of that writing was my different but same experience of first coming to San Francisco at that exact time. And in fact, there's a scene in that book, a party scene, that I'm pretty sure I was at that party. So that book is a little extra special to me. It really described the social milieu I was in at that moment. And then that book really is part of the, queer canon and the memoir canon. But she has many books, and everything I've picked up has been pretty fantastic.
Valencia is probably, if I was going to recommend one to a certain type of person, like that's probably the one I would be most likely to recommend. But I personally like Black Wave the best, which we talk about a bit with her.
Same. Absolutely same. Maybe we should set that up a bit. What is it about Black Wave?
So there's this kind of like newish thing that seems to be happening a lot in memoir, where it's basically your stories, but there's fantasy elements introduced in. Like the most recent one I read is Jim Carrey's Memoirs and Monsters, or whatever. I think he only has the one, so I'm sure you'll be able to find it. But it starts off like very similar to the movie This Is the End. Like it's just regular, real Hollywood people talking to each other, and then things get weirder and weirder and weirder until there's like an apocalyptic scenario. And then Black Wave is kind of the same, except for it deals with just regular ass people working at bookstores and restaurants and things like that. And it's set in a very Greg Araki LA, and it just has so much authenticness in her voice mixed with this like doomsday scenario kicking along in the background. And what I really like about her take on it is it's not prepper take or a supernatural writer's take. It's very much a normal person experiencing this like slow burn chaos in the background. And it feels very much like what the world feels like right now. I mean, she just nailed it.
Absolutely. All right, let's get to that conversation. Here's Michelle T.
I mean, there's been many moments where I've been like, so what's the plan? Like, is the plan that we just all get this and either die or not? Like, is that the way through this? It's like, feels really apocalyptic, but short of a vaccine, and I'm sure there's things about like herd immunity that I'm not quite understanding. It seems sort of like grisly in that way, you know? It's really scary. And so I'm actually moving my mom in with me from Florida. She's just been wasting away in Florida among all of the terrifying people who live there.
Yeah.
It makes me think of your book, Black Wave.
Yeah.
Like with the mother stuff.
A lot of people have been giving Black Wave a shout out during the pandemic, which, you know, I'll take it.
Sure. Well, I mean, it is something to be speaking to because Black Wave is a memoir with an apocalypse inside. And
Yeah.
so, it definitely raised questions for me about how you're sort of viewing what, I mean, at least to my mind, is the closest America as an entire country has come to an apocalypse scenario. I mean, there
Yeah.
have been some terrible localized real apocalypses in the last like decade, but this is something we're definitely all facing that resembles how we imagined part of the end of the world to look.
Yeah, I mean, all of those all the plague scenarios,
Yep.
right? Like
Yep.
look like this, you know? At the very beginning of quarantine, I feel like everybody was renting like Contagion.
We did an episode about it,
Oh, you did?
so
Okay,
we're
well, I
like right
won't.
there.
Oh my God, amazing, amazing. I won't talk about it since you've already
Oh no,
got
no,
the
please.
listeners have already.
More is
That movie
more.
is so fun. I just love how like we're just like supposed to like they had to make Gwyneth like an adulteress so that she kind of like deserved it all, you know?
Yeah, that's the tradition of horror movies. Sure, why not?
Exactly. So, whoa.
It would have been more fun if she had hooked up with the chef at the restaurant. I
For
think that would
real.
have been
Oh my God.
that would have given it more of like a service industry grit that I think I could have like
Yes.
totally appreciated.
So, Michelle, what is the most life affirming thing that you've been focusing on?
Well, I do these live tarot readings
Yeah.
once a week through my project, Your Magic, which is this media company that I'm building with a bunch of other amazing people. I started going live kind of early on with weekly tarot readings, and it's really nice. It makes me feel connected to other people and their issues and their problems. And so it's kind of like, I mean, I just love advice columns anyway. Like, I love hearing about people's problems, right? And there's a real gossip shortage. Like, lots of people have been complaining about the gossip shortage because there's just, there's less activity. Although people are having massive dramas and upsets, myself included. But in general, it's so slow. So it's both nice to be entertained by other people's problems. It's nice to be helpful and feel like I'm part of the world still. It's nice to have a reason to put on lipstick. I am very sick of looking at myself in a screen. Like, I never thought I would have to look at myself in a screen so much, but it's not so bad, I suppose. And it's just nice to feel connected. So that's the most life affirming thing I think I've been doing. Yeah, definitely. How about you guys?
I mean, I basically work all day from home, and I pretty much have just ingested mushrooms and weed almost every day for the last 40 days. So
really? You've been taking mushrooms every single day?
Yeah, a little bit during the day and a lot on the weekends.
Wow. What's that been like for you?
Well, I've been really like having this kind of return to my interest in all the stuff that Eric Davis talks about in his book High Weirdness, which I keep talking about on the show. I'm sure people are sick of hearing about it, but like everything from Philip K. Dick to William Burroughs to all these mystical currents.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's been really fun to just sort of lay around and think about things. I mean, I'd really say it's just become this sort of extended meditative practice, really. I mean, because for whatever reason, I don't get too fucked up. It's probably just a high tolerance or whatever, but I can go pretty hard and not really lose too much of myself. And it's just been making me think of like really enjoying like connecting with things I liked when I was like 12 and 13, like all the weird Church of Subgenius and alien shit.
Oh my God. That's so cute. And I forgot about the Church of Subgenius. What a great moment to connect with them.
Well, not so much them, but like all that stuff, like is like a just like a mise on or whatever. It's definitely like been fun and distracting, but I feel like I might need to buckle down and just get back into like lifting weights or something more serious.
Oh my God. Get out of your head and into your body.
I had some questions about Black Wave and the end, since I liked that book quite a bit.
Thank you.
And I feel like you really nailed the tone of what's happening now. Like some people are like, in that book, they've always been waiting for it to happen. And then other people just continue like spinning around in the wasteland of adulting a little bit. I think that tone is really interesting. And the other thing that I think is awesome in the book is the whole relationship with Matt Dillon. Like celebrities really feel like taken down to that level a little bit now, like to where they're like touchable, and so those are two things. I mean, what led you to make those choices for the book?
Well, the choice of like the tone, I suppose, as you said, with just the way that people were responding. I mean, part of it was, the closest to like an apocalyptic event that I'd experienced was 9/11, which I did experience when I was in Los Angeles. And it was possibly a slightly different Los Angeles than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And just watching the way that people went in and out of sort of denial about it, and some people super catastrophizing what the moment might mean, and then other people kind of blowing it off, and just thinking also about denial as like a mechanism. Like we all engage with denial every day just to like get through the day, on
Mm-hmm.
some level, just like walking past a homeless encampment to keep going and get to wherever we're on our way to, like a level of denial sort of kicks in just to kind of get us down the street. So it just was interesting to think about like what would happen, and it would probably seem so unreal, and then how to know that the world was truly ending, that this kind of famous moment that so many eras had imagined was upon them, that to know that for sure it was happening, what would that do to people? I thought about Melancholia a little bit, the movie Melancholia. I really love that movie. And yeah, it just seemed like it would be like existing in the face of any sort of trauma that you're kind of trying to exist without looking head on. There's so many people who've survived incredible trauma just like in the world among us. Like, how do they get through the day? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they end up just offing themselves because it just gets too much. And so I kind of imagine it would be very individual and personal, but patterns would emerge, right? Especially as everything wore on.
Mm-hmm.
That was the choice around that. And then Matt Dillon, get to the real point of the story, was the whole thing was a failed attempt for me to get to meet Matt Dillon. Some of what's in Black Wave is actual memoir, and some obviously is not. But I did work at a bookstore in Los Angeles, inspired by the bookstore in the book. And Matt Dillon did come in one day, and I did lose my mind because I've loved Matt Dillon since like Little Darlings, or like Over the Edge. Since Over the Edge, when I don't even know how old I was like enraptured by him. He's just like the ultimate like soulful bad boy, where you're like, is he a sociopath? Is he deep? What's going on? Like, what's happening under the like squinty eyes?
What about Rumblefish, huh?
Oh yeah. Oh my God, he's so great in Rumbles. What about Drugstore? Listen, any like Matt Dillon movie where he gets shot is like a great movie.
Mm-hmm.
He gets shot in Over the Edge, and he gets shot in The Outsiders, and he gets shot in Drugstore Cowboy, which is another fantastic movie. And I just love him. We have the same birthday.
So you didn't meet him? It was still unrequited?
I did meet him, but I couldn't talk to him. I was shocked. I was shocked that he'd walked into my bookstore. It was before I got sober. I was powerfully hungover. I felt like I looked like a raccoon, just like a scuzzy raccoon trash panda with like just weird, like fake butch clothes on and just like smudgy eyeliner. My hair was fucked up. And I was like, this is so sad. This is not how I want to meet Matt Dillon. And then I was just like, wake up, girl. Like, you live in Hollywood. Like, why are you leaving the house not looking your best? You could literally run into anybody, So it was a real wake up call for me. I definitely started moisturizing my face after that, but he never came back in again, even though I learned that the people who owned the bookstore knew him and like kept a special pile of vintage blues records, in the back for him because he's a collector. And that's what he had done. He had like brought a record up and asked me to play it because there was a record player behind the kiosk, behind the register, so people could listen to it, make sure the records were in good condition before they bought it. And I just couldn't handle it. And he was like trying to talk to me like a normal person. He like touched my arm. He did this horrible thing that men do when you're a woman and you have tattoos, where they like grab your arm like it's like a hunk of meat or something, and they just kind of move it around so they can look at your tattoos. It's so offensive.
I've seen it.
Yeah, it makes me want to kill unless it's Matt Dillon. And then I was just like, would you like my other arm? Would you like the rest of my body? What would you like? But like I couldn't actually interact with him. I was just dumbstruck.
I wonder if he's like other celebrities right now and he's just trying to make $1 on Cameo and you could just throw him a few bucks. to brighten your day.
If Matt Dillon is on Cameo, oh my God, I'm gonna look.
Jim Carrey just put out a book that I feel is very much in the vein of the type of memoir you do, with memoir with fantasy, which I think is such an exciting genre, and it's like kind of like really coming up right now. And he has like a very similar set of things that happen. People love the apocalypse, right?
People do love the apocalypse. I mean, we love to just see, I mean, we love disaster. Think about how disaster movies are so popular. And we just love to imagine. I mean, one thing I was thinking of, I was just thinking of endings a lot when I was writing Black Wave, because this long relationship that I had thought, would last forever had ended. And, when something like that happens, even if it feels painful and wrong, like where I end with it was like, well, it was supposed to end. And then you're just like, well, everything is supposed to end. Like, I'm going to die. Why do I think my relationship is supposed to last forever? And then I'm like, why do I think the earth is supposed to last forever? I mean, controversial thing to say. We love the earth. We want to protect it. And it's not like I'm like, fuck climate change. The earth is supposed to die. But just like on a deeper level, obviously, we're all supposed to strive for all of the varieties of justice while we're here, including environmental justice. But just like, yeah, maybe the earth is supposed to die too. And I just was thinking of that a lot while I was writing the book.
I wonder if that's also on the same spectrum as the amount of increase in conspiracy theories around COVID and everything else, is that it gives you an ability to feel like you're in control of the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So, you watch The Day After and there is fuck all you can do about it. But with COVID, well, you can just deny that it exists.
Right?
That's a way of dealing.
Totally. When I hear about people just like thinking, like really believing that it's a hoax, I'm like, what must the world look like to you? Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? That
Oh,
like,
yeah.
it's so baffling. It just makes me think about like in the 90s when I lived in San Francisco in this big like queer punk flop house. And one of my roommates at one point got like really hooked on speed and came into the living room and was like, there's tiny cops under the couch. And I'm just like, everything else seems like you're looking at me, you know who I am, you're saying my name, you know who you are, you know where the fridge is to go get, it's like we are sharing majority consensual reality, yet you think that tiny cops exist and that they're under our couch. And it's like, it was just so fascinating to me that I was just like, what happened that seems possible to you? It just makes me think of that with the people who are like denying. What kind of Truman Show like lifestyle do they think? Like, it's baffling. It's really baffling.
I feel like there's less of that than the media would let on, because I have a bunch of red state buddies and I have a friend that works in a bar out in Louisiana. And her argument wasn't really that it wasn't happening. It's just that there are no cases around us. So why do we have to shut down right now? Because
Right.
otherwise I'm going to be fucking poor because
Right.
I'm a waitress,
Right.
and that to me is a more understandable kind of position. It's a
Totally.
position I can empathize with a lot
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
And that gets blurred into like, look at all these clowns without their mask. Like it's very weird. And then the other thing that's hard for my buddies out there to understand is they're like, I have a friend couldn't go to his father's funeral,
Uh-huh.
but we have like 1,000 people at whatever politician that just died's funeral. I think there's like a perceived power imbalance too that it really makes a lot of
Sure.
people really
Yeah.
uncomfortable. I mean, and
Yeah.
none of that's to say it's not serious. I think just like I feel like the hard line, this is fake stuff is maybe a little bit overblown.
Uh-huh.
Maybe, or I could be wrong.
I am 1 degree of separation from at least 3 or 4 deniers.
Wow.
Like I have a couple of people in my life who are deniers, or their sibling is, or their parents are, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It's around.
Yeah.
It's not just rumors.
I mean, I have a couple friends that like basically huff Alex Jones all day. And even them, they're not like discounting that it's real. And then that's one of the things is like with the news, it makes it so hard to know what is real, and
Totally.
Yeah,
especially if you're like to look at more apocalyptic news sites, then you get all spun.
for sure.
What do you miss the most right now other than gossip?
I really miss going to karaoke. Like I really and
Oh,
to
I want to
think
do
now.
karaoke with you, Michelle.
Oh, well, we must, Mark, we must. I mean, but can you imagine? Like, just think of like a spitty communal karaoke mic now. Doesn't it just look so different than it ever
Yeah.
did? I'm just like, what a vector! Like, why would I have ever held that in my hand, let alone put it so close to my face? But yeah,
Right.
I miss karaoke. I kind of miss like nightclubs, even though I don't go to them very often. I like knowing that they're there. And I'm going through a divorce in COVID, which has been very apocalyptic. But leading up to that, my ex had been going out a ton. And so, like, as it was getting into the spring, I was like, springtime's gonna be my time. Like, I'm going out in the spring because we, are sharing childcare responsibilities, so we can't both go out all the time. So I was like, definitely putting dibs on some significant nights on the town that never happened.
That's not fair.
It's so not fair. I mean, and then travel. I'm supposed to be in Scotland right now at a book festival that is no more. So I love traveling, and I'm really lucky with work that I almost always have something lingering in the future, something hovering in the future that I can look forward to. And I don't have that. And I'm going to turn 50 in February. And I always thought, oh, I will do some sort of big, cool trip, for my 50th birthday. It's like such a major birthday. And my sister had the nerve the other day to be like, well, whatever, if we're able to travel in February. And it's like that kind of sentiment keeps getting pushed further and further into the future, where I'm like, certainly by my birthday, I'll be able to go like somewhere, right? I could probably go to like Mexico or something, but if I wanted to go to Europe or something like that, I don't know if they'll be letting us in.
I wouldn't let us in.
We deserve everything bad that happens to us,
For
America.
real.
I
Oh my
mean,
God.
Jesus Christ, I know. Yeah. What do you guys miss?
Sunday morning movies. That was like my thing. I would go to whatever, like a 10 a.m. show on a Sunday by myself. There'd never be any mouth breathers around me, just chucking popcorn into their faces. It was a delight. And like, I don't see a lot of new stuff, but so like once or twice a month I would do that. And it was always like a good time.
That is so awesome. That is like the height of self-care, taking yourself to the movies alone. Amazing. I love that.
I miss hugs, and that can sound hokey, but like I miss going to the stud and hugging all my friends. I miss going to work, which I'm a bartender, and hugging all my friends. I just miss like copious human contact, and I know that that's the thing. Like we'll be going to movies and bars way before we're going to be touching each other. Even that. Like I feel like the thing I miss most is the thing that is probably the longest off.
It's so strange. Like if you are a hugger, like I'm a hugger, and it's like it's so weird not to be able to like greet people, with a hug. My sister, just like people that I'm so close to that I really want to give a big hug to. And especially like going through this divorce in COVID, like I've stabilized emotionally for the most part, but like the month of June was like so dark, right? It just was like a very apocalyptic month for me. And just to not be able to hug anyone.
Yeah.
And even like, my sister would come and just like be with me to give me support. And it just was like it was so weird. It was such a strange thing to go through. Like an emotional wrenching like that. It's absolutely the time when you want to be around all your friends. You do want to go out and dance, and you want to go like have casual sex with a stranger, or you want to go do whatever thing. You want to go split town and run away, It's like what all of the things that I like my go-tos during moments of extreme emotional distress, like none of them were available to me. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. It's interesting that I don't know how it really erupted, but you know how I don't know about you, but I did not grow up with friends saying I love you. I feel like that was like another generation or two past where that just sort of became so common.
Right.
Is that a thing?
Like millennials all like, I love you, I love you, I love you. Like it's very thrown off. And I'm all for it. And I feel like I'm so glad that's in place because you can't hug people, but you can tell them you love them
That's so sweet.
incessantly. And I think we need to, because that's kind of the most connected you can really get to most people right now, is reminding them that you care.
Yeah. Oh God, that's so true. That's so true.
I think the only people in my adult life who do that are like my wife and I have these friends that all live up in Humboldt. They, of course, all say it, and I remember being very uncomfortable with it the first time we went up there. I was like, "Oh, we're new friends." Like, I don't know that I told my mom this.
Wow.
It's interesting to hear you say, Mark, that it's like a generational thing. I do believe that that's true. And also, like, I feel like I grew up in such a harsh city. Like, nobody would ever be so vulnerable as to be like, love you. It's like, it also feels maybe like regional in a way too. Like,
maybe
like California millennial or something.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where everything good starts, so.
For sure.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope that before the world ends, that Michelle T is able to at least have a coffee with Matt Dillon.
Well, he's a listener of this podcast, so I'm sure
Yeah.
we're helping
He's
make
always
that
trying to-
happen.
He keeps wanting to come on for Gremlins too, but I just don't know if I have it in me.
I still want to do bring your own microphone karaoke with Michelle.
Yeah, I don't know that I will ever do karaoke in my life ever again, but like people like Michelle make it seem really fun and make it seem like almost like a good idea.
I love watching karaoke. I really do. I'm perfectly happy to not participate. I think it's really fun to just watch people give what they have, no matter what it is.
I was thrown out of the Mint karaoke bar in San Francisco a long time ago, so I don't think I can ever go there again.
I doubt they have your photo on the wall. What did you do to get kicked out of the Mint? They
had patio furniture in their back patio when I got there, and when I left, it wasn't in the back patio anymore.
You've been in my house.
But I don't drink anymore though, and like that's one of the reasons why is because like when I was a drinker, if there was a trash can in a window, the trash can would be through the window. You know, like I was very vandalous as a drinker.
Amazing. So next we are talking to Meg Elison. She is the author of many books. Her first novel was The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, which is the first part of the Road to Nowhere series. And she just put out a really delightful, I believe it's technically a young adult novel called Find Layla, which I adored. And we know Meg because we did a live event once with our friend Jeremy Lassen at Borderland Books to cover the first It movie.
She's like actually reached out to us, which I thought was so, like I'd never really met a writer. I mean, I guess I maybe have met a couple before, but I'd never really like met a writer like that. And she was basically like, I am an expert on this. Borderlands Books, kind of my home turf. How about having me on? And I remember just being like, yeah, of course. And I went to her website and looked at it, and she and I have a lot in common. We both grew up kind of, I think her growing up was a bit more troubled than mine was, but we weren't supposed to go to UC Berkeley, and we both did. And we both came through a community college system, and we both loved Stephen King growing up. And, you know, she's a super fan of Sandman, and so am I. So like every time I talk to her, I just feel like she's a fellow traveler, and she was a copywriter like I am right before her first book came out. And then the book was her escape from that lifestyle. So I have an enormous amount of admiration for her.
She's the best. All right. Here's Meg Elison.
I wrote my first novel about a pandemic because it has successfully been a contributor to cataclysmic events in the past. And because I believed we were underprepared, and I thought that back under a much more competent administration, so that's only more true now. And I also worried about not specifically the social issues that we've been seeing, like not the resistance to masks, but the resistance to facts, the question of whether or not people would accept the nature of the disease itself or a vaccine. And I did expect it to be bad. I just didn't expect it to be this absurd. This has been a much weirder apocalypse than I think I could have imagined.
Yeah, I've been thinking about different narratives about the apocalypse, including yours, and something that is certainly not in many movies about the end of the world is that usually apocalypse movies are like, they're usually action movies, and there's a lot of people and a lot of dynamics, but the way that this apocalypse sort of mirrors things like your first novel, In the Road, that mirrors what we're going through, is it's actually kind of lonely.
Yeah, it's spectacularly lonely.
Yeah.
I remember in The Road, one of the things I found most affecting was that the main character and his son were obviously aching for contact with other people. They wanted it really badly, and then when they got it, they couldn't trust it, and they didn't know what to do with it. And I keep reading these like half-joking memes about how when we get to open up again, we'll have forgotten our social graces and we'll all look like, you know, shambling shoggoths. But I don't think that's the worst of it. I think the worst of it is that a year from now, we'll still be quizzing each other about what our protocols have been and whether you've been vaccinated and whether you had it at all. And the suspicion, I'm worried, will linger.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, because of the way that this is developed, we actually have been imbued with a paranoia about other people.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, not wanting to contract COVID, but then paranoia about are they responding in the way that we deem correct, which is really fundamental because it's not just about whether or not you can trust to be around somebody, but whether or not you trust their values in things like facts and science
Right.
and community. That again is something that sort of mirrors the very exaggerated apocalypse narratives of being out on the road and trusting no one. It's
Yeah.
another form of that, but it's politicized in a way that a lot of apocalypse fiction isn't.
Yeah.
I've been running this hell is other people programming for so long that it feels pretty normal, like just walking around. Like I can go days without talking to another person, like no problem. Like when my wife's out of town, like I might wave to the male person. That's pretty much it.
I like having time alone. Like it's always been important to me. I like it in equal measure to time with people. And when I don't get one or the other, it seems my personality suffers for it somewhat.
Yeah, something I just noticed recently is all of the podcasts that I've been following for like 5 years, let's say, all of them are kind of boring lately. Like especially even the ones that are comedians who like have spent their lives honing a sort of very active, engaged way of interacting with people and each other. They all sound so tired and like you can hear them trying really hard to muster up the energy to be entertaining, and it's fairly transparent that it's not working.
It's just really hard to come up with new subjects of conversation. We're all talking about the same 5 things, and it's
right.
stultifying.
Yeah. Yeah. So your work really engages with very dark material and confronts the dark side of humanity and human behavior. How has this time that is pretty dark changed your perception of those things? Are you watching more fluff? Are you reading lighter material? Are you going darker and confronting it hard? Is the pendulum swinging wildly?
The pendulum is swinging wildly.
Yeah, same.
I've definitely sought out dark depictions of slow disasters in progress has been the theme as near as I can tell. I follow a YouTuber who specializes in film editing, and he did an entire episode about the movie Contagion. But instead of his usual style of delivery, he gave his essay as a monologue over B-roll footage of himself dejectedly lying on his couch while the movie Contagion was sort of projected over his prone form. And it was such a big mood for this quarantine. So I watched that and then watched Contagion and then watched that again. I was watching Mad Men on a loop until they removed it from Netflix. I'm so upset. Although I will say that show makes me feel like I should be smoking and drinking constantly.
Well, maybe you should.
Maybe I should.
I mean, like, at this point, what the fuck are you waiting for?
Truly. I did, when lockdown first started, stock up my bar, and I just thought to myself, well, damn, I can day drink. Let's just day drink. Not, of course, that I do that while I'm working. But I found very quickly that the social component of drinking is why I find it most compelling, and it is not fun to do alone.
Yeah.
So Mad Men is no longer. And as in any time of trouble or stagnation in my life, I have begun to rewatch Buffy. And then I also found I could not look away from the limited series Chernobyl on HBO.
Yeah.
The combination of disbelief, scientific illiteracy, and bureaucratic propaganda control that allowed the disaster at Chernobyl to, nearly decimate the continent of Europe feels just displaced enough to not, keep me up at night, but also quite similar in theme to what I'm experiencing. So,
Absolutely.
but at the same time, like tonight, I watched an episode of the Gummy Bears animated show, and then an episode of Darkwing Duck, and then Tailspin.
Wow, you're going for it.
I'm going for it, but it's been both ways. How about you guys?
Well, it's funny you should mention Chernobyl because I just watched the movie adaptation of Child 44,
Oh yeah,
which, have you read the book?
I have.
I loved the book.
Yeah.
And it's a total page turner.
Mhm.
But the thing that really grabbed me was how it depicted the total sense of paranoia in the Soviet Union. Like, nobody's to be trusted. You have to second guess everyone's intention at every moment of the day. And that is kind of how Chernobyl happened as well, is you're always being watched, and you don't know when someone tells you something, you don't know if you're being tested
Right.
or what's happening.
And that paranoia leads to the importance of appearances above all else.
Yes. But you don't even know what that appearance is supposed to be half the time.
Right.
And
Right.
we're not living nearly to that degree at the moment, but that is a large part of this American apocalypse that we're dealing with at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Lindsay Ellis, who's a novelist and also a YouTuber, posted a picture of where she lives in LA. And it was this high drama sunset and palm trees. And between the two palm trees, there was strung a big banner that said margaritas available to go.
Oh.
And she was like, I don't think any of us envisioned an apocalypse quite like this. Because you're right. Like, there are certain aspects of life as we know it that are just holding out. Like, I ordered pizza tonight. Like, in some ways, life feels super normal, and in every other way, it does not.
Yeah. I don't know how you guys feel, but I don't really feel like this is like the end. I mean, like as bad as the virus is, it's not like the stand, it's not killing enough people to completely destabilize just from like attrition. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I think more than anything, it's just the death of systems. Our system, if we had taken it a little bit more seriously up front, we wouldn't even felt this. Like if we had like a better relationship with China, maybe it wouldn't have even gone off the way it had.
Or if we hadn't dismantled our own pandemic response team, for example.
Right.
Yeah, it feels more like the virus is the way the government's set up and the way the economy's set up than it is the actual like COVID.
And this volatile combination of the aftermath of the virus, a sudden economic contraction, and let's face it, widespread uprising against cops across the nation. You're right. It's not the end of the world like the stand. Everybody's not going to die. It's just that this country cannot exist in the form it currently occupies. This is revolution. That is what we're seeing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Meg's super social, like when you follow her on social media and stuff, you realize like how it's a way of being a writer that I never really considered. I always think about being Cormac McCarthy in a barn with no one around for 6 miles and just cranking out something and just throwing it over a fence and going back to your hole when it's done. Like to me, that's what writing feels like. And what Meg has going on feels a lot more like even like it's like a queer genre, lost generation kind of thing. It's interesting.
I think that's my archetype of a writer. When I think of the archetype of a writer that I've had since I was like 10 years old, it was someone who lives in the grimiest corner of New York and every night gets blackout drunk and yells about art before passing out. That to me is what the archetype of a writer is. It's very social. It's aggressively social. I guess this overlaps with Michelle T because, I mean, I can't speak for her, but it seems to me that her version of being a writer is very social. She was very instrumental in creating a lot of very active communities and reading scenarios to get writers, especially queer writers and queer women writers, to get together and be social and connect and exchange ideas. So I would assume that for her, the very notion of being a writer is maybe as social as being in a band, It seems very antithetical to part of your writing is to actually be distracted by people, but Gotta get your life somewhere.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of drama though. Both like just the online lives of the connected authors seems very like one of them fucks up, and you got to do the whole thing where you choose a side. It just seems awful.
That's called having friends.
See, that's why I have none.
Yeah.
I do have, but I don't have friends that engage in spaces that I like. All of my friends are very disconnected. Like if you took the 5 dudes I hang out with the most and sat them next to each other, it would be like a line at the DMV. Like you would be like, "There's none of this. This doesn't make any sense at all."
Amazing. Next, we speak with Lawrence English. Lawrence is a composer and artist from Brisbane, Australia, and he runs the label Room 40. I've seen him live several times, and I can honestly say it is one of the most overwhelming, crushing, beautiful, sublime experiences I've ever had in a theater.
And what is it about his show that's so memorable? Is it the music is so bold, or does he have a live show experience that's worth noting?
He often invites people to come and lie down on the stage instead of stay in their seats. And I've watched his shows both from the seats and from lying down with my eyes closed on the stage. And he has these 2 Ampeg full, like 810s full stacks, and just has so much low end. And it feels like it's oceanic, just crushing waves of sound. It's these intricate drones that are at once really detailed and delicate and beautiful, with this, again, oceanic heaviness that is swimming throughout the performance.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool.
It's pretty cool.
I mean, other than that sounds like gloomy and apocalyptic, what is it about his work that made you want to have him for this conversation? I mean, like Michelle T wrote a book about the end of the world. Meg Elison wrote a trilogy about the end of the world.
I think it's that his work grapples with heavy ideas in a way that you can't really say that necessarily with a lot of artists. A lot of artists are very, especially musicians, are very wrapped up in the materiality of music, more interested in abstraction and gear. Whereas Lawrence, it feels like music is the vehicle for ideas rather than the end in itself. Although he is so focused on that materiality at the same time. He does a lot of work with field recordings, and so his music is often examining the nature of sound and recorded sound.
Huh. That sounds cool.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. When we first emailed Lawrence English and asked him to be on the podcast and answer the question, "Is this how you thought it would all end?" he responded, "It's a very good question you pose. I think, in fact, it's many ends, not just a singular one. I'd side on the pleasure of postmodernity and reject the singular narrative in favor of a cascade of death. Why have one when you can have so many meta-deaths all piling on each other?" Which is a great place to work from. So here's Lawrence English.
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition, this idea of ending. And actually, it's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment for a number of different reasons. I think the thing that's really stuck out for me is there's this very strong aesthetic, this aesthetic of ending that has kind of revealed itself in a whole bunch of different ways. And whenever there's a transitional moment, there's a lot of gesture that goes with that. And that might be like the kind of public protest stuff that we see. It's the kind of messaging of politics. And then at the same time, this sort of not quite forward-facing messaging you get from business and other things about, how it is that this idea of what it might mean to go forward, and this bipolar sort of desire partly for this continuation of what has come before, and at the same time this recognition that that can never be. No matter what happens going forward, it is not going to be the same scenario that we faced the last, really 100 years.
Yeah, it seems that we are in this position where it sort of doesn't matter where you're coming from in terms of some sort of politics or even revolutionary politics of any sort, that whether or not you want things to change very, very radically, we're now confronting a reality where everything is going to change and we have no idea what that's going to look like or even when it's going to become that thing.
I think there's also this giving over of control. Like that's one of the things that's really come out of this at the moment is that like you can see people trying to apply a sense of control or agency. And it's really clear that that possibility is so fraught. I mean, it's fraught all the time, but I think in moments like now, what we see is this recognition that it is incredibly fraught. It's not something that is instantly attainable, and to strive for it becomes that much more fatiguing. I mean, my hat's off for you folks in North America, the kind of resilience that's come through from the Black Lives Matter protests. And I guess the things that are beginning to poke their head through in parallel with that, I mean, obviously that have always been present in North America, but are coming to the fore right now. It's quite extraordinary to see people digging into themselves and mining out this extra resilience. The lack of fatigue in people has been extraordinary to watch. And I think that's another interesting thing in terms of this idea of, you know, how it's all going to end. I mean, this idea of all ending for me is kind of the interesting part of the question. I think it's this multiplicity of ends that's going on. But out of that, there's, you know, I have this friend, Caitlin Fransman, who's a fantastic artist, and she had this work once that sort of had this very nice statement on it, which is like, all fertility requires decay. And I think we're right now beginning to see the first wave of fertility out of what is the decay of the 20th century. I'm actually quite optimistic. I mean, I'm always optimistic. I like to think of it as a position of radical optimism. But I'm very optimistic about where things are because there is this appetite, and it's a kind of renewed appetite that we haven't seen for really, you know, probably 50 years or more, around a whole bunch of issues to do with a kind of progression of the self and progression of community. I think in the case of North America, a recognition of the community, which hasn't really been something that has been at our forefront of our minds probably since the mid to late 70s. You know, the kind of neoliberal project has really dominated us and has broken down that kind of sense of collegiality that was so much a part of how we'd operated up until that point, to varying degrees, obviously, but that there was an aspiration to collegiality and community that was valued. And I think, you know, looking back at some of those comments from Thatcher during that period, you know, they typify the problems that we face now. They were the first call, and we're the depleted echo now of what we're trying to navigate out of is very much a result of those conversations that were being had. And I guess that was probably the early 80s in the UK and certainly in North America. For me, if we're, you know, going back to the question of this idea of, you know, how it's all going to end, I tell you what is ending: the 20th century. These are the final death throes of the 20th century, and it's been a bit of a prolonged death. I think it's longer than other centuries may be ending. I think the 19th century ended very dramatically with World War One. The 20th century is kind of thrashing about a bit more. It doesn't quite want to go into the ground, but we're close. The last breaths, I think, are being gasped. And, you know, the breath might be a bit smelly, but I'm feeling some serious breath freshener coming on for the 21st century.
Amazing.
I think it's going to get really weird. I think we're going to get this weird bifurcated tech feudalism mixed with some sort of like very shoddy UBI.
Yeah, well, look, the UBI is a really interesting question. And I mean, for me, that's something I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about in the last, probably most of this decade. Because, you know, there has been these conversations in countries like Finland and Scotland, wherever else, where there have been some trials. And what's interesting is the COVID pandemic has just been the tinder for a whole bunch of, and I don't mean, you know, unfortunate dating. It has been the opportunity for a whole bunch of sparks to take root. I mean, if you look at education, if you look at the growth of online retail, all of that kind of stuff, that was all there. It was all already happening. It was already planned. And what COVID has done is allowed this stuff to be sort of railroaded through very quickly. So at least here, and obviously in some states in North America, there is some support as well, that this kind of, in Australia, we call it job seeker, which is if you don't have a job and you're trying to find one, you get a kind of top up on what would be a sort of social security check. And then there's this other one called Job Keeper, which is kind of like a amount that you get every month that is to kind of hold your job so when you come back, the industry or the business still exists. And those two payments have essentially allowed there to be a reimagination or a permission to reimagine what social benefits might look like in Australia. We've had a very long period of Conservative government here that has been about diminishing social security, but suddenly there's this opportunity, and it's not wholesale, but it's enough that some of these things, like the fact that, you know, the universal basic income has been talked about in our parliament, is a huge step, and talked about by Conservative politicians is a huge step. Even though it's just words, the fact that somehow we can look at that moment and see like what was unthinkable is suddenly thinkable. And I think that thinking the unthinkable is where we need to be right now. And it's interesting just to see that things that were completely off the grid are suddenly on there. And I think it's for us to take those and then start to pick them up and run with them. And I think that's what is happening. You're seeing a lot of actual discussion around this. And I think if we are to have this UBI, if we're to persist with capitalism, the UBI is the only way that there is going to be any money moving around within the system. Everything else is being backed up by Jeff Bezos, it seems like. So, I mean, he's not really spending, unless he's buying a lot on his own site, and this is just some kind of huge internal oscillation. All of that money is just kind of disappearing out of the market. So if we're going to have any kind of workable economic system, the UBI is going to need to become part of that, because capitalism, it needs blood, and the blood is cash. And right now there is not a lot of cash going around in the market. And obviously governments are trying to stimulate some of that stuff. But it's just a very interesting time to kind of recognize that there is this potential that if it becomes recognized that disposable income has a value that's in excess of the kind of political, the dirtiness of welfare and the kind of, for you guys, the concerns over socialism and communism, if we are able to get past those and recognize the value of that, I think there is a chance for this stuff to begin to take root. And I think, to be honest with you, in North America, it will be the slowest place to pick that up. I think in Europe, potentially in Australia, in parts of Southeast Asia, there might be a chance for it to take hold a bit more quickly. And we're not talking about next year. Realistically, this is something that's probably a generation away. But I think that the conversations that are started now are going to come to something really fruitful later.
Yeah. So in the midst of this death of the 20th century, in the midst of the meta deaths all piling on each other, what are you most looking forward to potentially dying off?
It's a good question. You know, entitlement. And look, obviously that's a huge thing right now because of the Karen and Kevin epidemic. But I think the reason that stuff has come to the surface now is because of this current predicament that we find, this sort of sense of entitlement and the kind of people being emboldened to sort of carry through with things that would have been completely unacceptable even a decade ago, that they're suddenly like able to be said, able to be done. But I get the sense that there is a recognition, even from those people involved in that stuff, that it's potentially unacceptable. And even if it's that part of that recognition is to do with the fact that what may not have been documented before is documented, and there is this kind of flow back that comes to them. And I think that is an interesting moment to take stock of. And for me, that is one thing I'll be quite content to sort of see go out the window. Just a little bit of generosity. That's what really strikes me whenever I come to the States. And, you know, the United States has a dear place in my heart. Some very good friends there, and I really love some parts of that country. But what I find really extraordinary is even when people are particularly prickly and difficult, like even when I'm coming through border control, which is, you know, notoriously an arduous process, just I always think of people like plants. It sounds very strange, I know, but like all you have to do is pour a little bit of water onto someone and they will come into bloom, almost always. A little bit of generosity, a little bit of like interest in what they're doing, in how they are, and all of that thing. I just think it's amazing to watch people bloom. And that's one of my favorite things about coming to North America, is interacting with people that I guess maybe don't get that so often in their day. And for us as Australians, it's kind of how we operate. We have this sort of sense of mateship that, you know, is, you know, partly kind of cultural mythology. But I think part of it is ingrained enough in us that we're pretty generous, and we genuinely enjoy interacting with people for the most part. There are other exchanges to happen, and they should all happen in the sort of fertility of the 21st century. Let the 20th century just, rot in the ground. Let those cultural tropes go, and let's, get into being who we want to be.
So how awesome do you think being in Australia for the apocalypse is?
Well, I think that my vision of what an apocalypse looks like is actually mostly framed by Australian cinema, starting with Mad Max and the Road Warrior, which I saw when I was quite young. And so many Australian films are about that desert, about that expansiveness. Walkabout, they're all sort of in these endlessly empty landscapes. So Australia, just in my imagination, already is the apocalypse if I just kind of ignore the fact that it has some of the biggest cultural centers on planet Earth. But Lawrence is surprisingly upbeat for the apocalypse, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
clearly the end times, and he's framing it as a certain type of end times, and sounds quite optimistic about it all. I also appreciate the outside perspective on what's happening in the US, because it's so easy to think about when you live here, you're like, oh my God, America's so obsessed with itself and it thinks it's the center of the universe. But then when you talk to people from other countries, they often are talking a lot about America too, because this place is such this petri dish for the most exaggerated insanities of the world, right?
Yeah. Well, we have a disproportionate amount of excellent media talent, whether it be bands or musicians or actors or directors. I mean, it seems to be like America's coolest export is our pop culture.
Yeah, so everybody's got to confront it.
But one of the things I think that America does really well is it's able to mine itself for new voices for that pop culture. I mean, like in horror right now, there are so many novels being written by like The Only Good Indians is written by a Native American dude. There's that book Mexican Gothic, but they're just starting to happen, like way more Afrofuturism in comic books. And it just seems like whatever America reshapes into, I wonder if it'll still be able to be like this cultural reactor powering like all the culture of the world.
Yeah, I wonder about that, because for the last 15 years, I'd say I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which China might take over as the position that America has held in so many ways. But America seems to be failing in so many ways, but it does not seem to be yielding culturally. Its cultural exports seem to still be very, very strong and very, very powerful in the global imagination.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be shifting.
Like something I was thinking about the other day is like how dominant American YouTube celebrities are on YouTube. It had such a potential for being radically decentralized, and it should have been, right? And there are gigantic, there's huge like Muslim channels, and there's all these different like kind of like little waterways in the YouTube ecosystem. But the biggest channels all seem to be like American or at least Western centric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, is that what people want from culture, or have we just like shoved it down people's throats for so long as what they think's tasty?
Well, it's hard to say, because I mean, in the instance of some place like China, the thing that makes it an economic powerhouse does not necessarily mean that the world is interested in a 21st century of socialist realism in cinema or something. It's just not nearly as compelling.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just saw an article today that said China is this generation's Nazi Germany. Like, that should work itself out, huh?
We'll see.
Yeah.
So what have we learned?
Well, you come into this world alone, you go through the apocalypse with a few people, and then you leave this world alone. So I guess you got to be really careful about who you spend end times with.
I've always wondered about that alone thing. It has always struck me as something that sounds better than it is true.
Well, it's also completely untrue. Like you are born at least with your mother there, like in some capacity, whether you are removed from a clone jar or come out the old-fashioned way. I mean, there's definitely someone else around. You don't just sui generis into the universe. I mean, you could easily die alone.
Sure.
That I mean, that shit happens every day to the saddest amongst us. So you may die alone.
It's very poetic and it's very nihilistic, and it sounds like a cool thing to grunt when you're out on the plains riding a horse, but I don't know. I don't know that it applies to my life, but who knows how it'll end for me.
Mm.
So I would like to remind everybody that you can email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org, and we would love for you to send in your answer. Is this how you thought it would all end? Let us know. We want to know what your answer is. We need data.
Yeah, and let us know what you think about this kind of like wave of format for our show, because usually it's just conversation. I feel like we barely hit horror movies anymore. Like we're more like the conversation is adjacent to horror in some ways.
We do have plans to cover the Glenn Danzig atrocity Verotica, which I kind of recommend people see if they're into damaged movies. We'll be covering that someday soon, but I feel like we've got a lot of extra content that we've been sort of wrapped up in since COVID hit.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
Nope. If you haven't already, stockpile your ammunition and figure out your plans for fighting against whoever your enemies are in the coming end times.
Whatever militia you belong to, best of luck. Good hunting. I want to thank so much Michelle T., Meg Elison, and Lawrence English for sharing their thoughts with us. And thank you, listeners, for listening. That's your cue to agree with gratitude.
Well, thanks, guys. You've been great.
Okay, I think that's good.
An armed society is a polite society, Mark.
I think you can be polite without a gun too, Chad.
I don't know, dude. Look at California.
Fuck. All right, I'm gonna stop recording. That was glorious.